January 17, 1944. The dawn air over the Pacific is thick with mist, and the metallic tang of salt on the jagged cliffs of the island. Captain Hara tightens his grip on the binoculars, eyes scanning the horizon where faint silhouettes of American ships glint under the rising sun. His men crouch in shallow foxholes, the tension palpable, every breath measured. The jungle behind him is a murmur of movement, birds disturbed, leaves trembling with anticipation. Ahead, the beaches lie empty, deceptively calm, but Hara knows the truth. Within moments, the quiet will shatter somewhere beyond the breakers. Hundreds of American rifles and machine guns are preparing to speak at once. A single drop of sweat traces down Hara's temple as the first distant thrum of artillery echoes from the ocean. The ground beneath him seems to vibrate with an unseen pulse, as if the island itself senses the coming storm. He tightens his jaw, every calculation, every defensive plan, every hope of holding the line is about to be tested. And then, all at once, the guns open. By early 1944, the Pacific theater had become a vast, grinding contest of strategy, logistics, and sheer endurance. Japan's early victories in 1941 and 1942, rapidly seizing territories from the Philippines to the Solomon Islands, had given way to a harsher reality. American industrial might and naval power were beginning to turn the tide. The U.S. had adopted an island-hopping strategy, bypassing heavily fortified positions to strike at weaker targets, gradually closing in on Japan's inner defensive perimeter. Every island captured brought the Americans closer to the heart of Japanese supply lines and airfields. Captain Hara, a seasoned officer in the Imperial Japanese Army, was stationed on one such island and outpost critical to Japanese communications and defense in the Central Pacific. The island's jagged cliffs, dense jungle, and narrow beaches had made it a natural defensive stronghold. Yet, beneath the surface of his confidence lay an awareness of the mounting imbalance. Japanese supply lines were overstretched. Reinforcements arrived irregularly, often slowed by American submarine patrols and air raids. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies were scarce, and morale was fraying as news of previous defeats filtered through the ranks. The Americans approaching Hara's position were a disciplined, battle-hardened force. The 7th Fleet, equipped with amphibious transports, battleships, and carrier-based aircraft, had perfected the coordination of bombardment and landing. Each landing craft carried not just men, but the firepower of the U.S. Army and Marine Corps, rifles, machine guns, mortar, and the increasingly feared M1 Garand rifles, capable of rapid, sustained fire. Intelligence reports suggested the Japanese were aware of the impending assault, but the scale and precision of the American attack were difficult to anticipate. Intelligence for Hara came in fragments. Intercepted radio signals hinted at troop movements, but the fog of war clouded details. Reconnaissance planes had spotted ships amassing beyond the horizon. Yet these glimpses offered only partial insight. Every Japanese defensive measure, trenches, bunkers, barbed wire, was prepared under a shadow of uncertainty. Hara knew the Americans would test the defenses relentlessly, using combined arms in a calculated sequence designed to overwhelm. The Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized disciplined, close-quarters resistance. Soldiers were trained to fight to the last man, holding every ridge and bunker. Yet this bravery came at a cost. Rigid adherence to orders often clashed with the unpredictable nature of modern warfare. Hara's role was to balance strategic insight with the immediate survival of his men. Knowing that a single misjudgment could unravel the entire defensive line, each day brought anxious drills, stockpiling of ammunition, and constant reconnaissance patrols along the coastline. Meanwhile, the wider strategic context weighed heavily on commanders like Hara. The fall of nearby islands had cut off communication and supply, forcing Japanese forces into isolated pockets. The U.S. Navy's superior control of the Seas and skies meant that relief or retreat was almost impossible. Hara was acutely aware that the coming battle would not only test his leadership but also the very limits of endurance for his men. His island, like others before it, was becoming a crucible, a place where planning, courage, and desperation would collide under the concentrated fire of American weaponry. Amid this tension, the psychological burden was immense. Japanese soldiers had been indoctrinated with the ethos of unwavering loyalty. But the anticipation of facing overwhelming firepower created a shadow of doubt even in the most disciplined ranks. The calm exterior of officers belied a storm of calculations, fears, and grim determination. Hara moved through his positions, checking foxholes and bunkers, offering terse reassurances while silently preparing for a barrage he knew could decimate his men in minutes. And so on the eve of battle, the island seemed suspended in a moment of tense anticipation. The wind rustled through the coconut palms, waves lapped against coral reefs, and the distant silhouette of the American fleet grew sharper by the hour. Every detail, the terrain, the defenses, the enemy's strength, would matter when the first shells fell and rifles erupted in a chorus of deadly precision. For Hara, the line between survival and catastrophe was measured in seconds. The horizon promised a storm, and with it, the reality that would soon become his nightmare. The island's geography was both a blessing and a curse for Hara's forces. Steep cliffs loomed over narrow beaches, restricting the avenues of attack but also concentrating defensive fire on predictable landing points. Dense jungle inland offered concealment, yet it hindered communication and movement. Every trench and bunker had been carved into the coral and earth with painstaking care, each reinforced with sandbags and timber salvaged from wrecked supply ships. Despite these preparations, Hara knew that natural defenses alone could not withstand the combined weight of American firepower. By mid-January, American forces had completed meticulous reconnaissance. Photographs from aerial surveillance revealed the positions of Japanese fortifications, while amphibious exercises simulated landings on similar terrain. Intelligence officers mapped the likely locations of trenches, machine gun nests, and artillery emplacements. The Americans were preparing for a synchronized attack. Naval bombardments would soften the defenses, fighter bombers would strafe positions inland, and infantry would storm the beaches under the cover of suppressive fire. The plan relied on overwhelming the defenders before they could effectively organize counterattacks. Hara, aware of these possibilities, organized his men into layered defensive zones. Foxholes were staggered along the beachhead, each connected by narrow paths that could be defended or abandoned in sequence. Artillery was limited but strategically placed, with mortar and anti-tank guns covering approach routes. The Japanese also dug secondary positions inland, allowing survivors from the front line to continue resistance. Still, ammunition was scarce. Each soldier was acutely aware that every round fired must count, every shot measured against the inevitability of American numerical superiority. The human element added another layer of complexity. Hara's men were drawn from a mixture of experienced veterans and freshly conscripted soldiers, many of whom had never seen combat. Morale fluctuated daily, a delicate balance between courage, fear, and fatalism. Officers drilled discipline into the troops relentlessly, but even the most steadfast soldiers felt the tension of an impending assault that would test them to the limit. Rumors of previous defeats circulated through the ranks, whispering of islands lost, bunkers flattened, and comrades annihilated under the relentless barrage of American weapons. Meanwhile, supply shortages imposed harsh practical constraints. Food rations were meager, often limited to rice and preserved fish. Water had to be carefully conserved. Medical supplies were minimal, leaving injuries likely to become fatal if treatment was delayed. Hara understood that the fight was not only against an external enemy, but against the environment itself. Heat, humidity, disease, and exhaustion threatened to erode his force from within before the first shot was fired. Communication was a constant concern, field radios were unreliable, and runners carrying orders risked ambush in the thick jungle. Coordination between infantry and artillery depended on painstaking timing and prearranged signals. Any misstep could create gaps in the defensive line, exposing units to devastating enfilade fire. Hara constantly recalculated contingencies, moving reserves, reinforcing weak points, and ensuring that each sector had overlapping fields of fire. The margins for error were vanishingly small. Beyond logistics and terrain, the psychological dimension loomed over Hara and his officers. Japanese military doctrine emphasized honor and sacrifice. Yet the reality of facing overwhelming enemy firepower weighed heavily. Officers spoke in measured tones. But fear was never far from the surface, both their own and that of their men. As the American fleet edged closer, the island seemed to exhale, carrying the anticipation of the coming storm in the rustle of palm fronds and the ceaseless crash of waves. By the morning of January 17th, every defensive measure had been finalized. Hara made his rounds one last time, inspecting positions, urging vigilance, and silently acknowledging the stakes. The enemy was close enough that the men could make out the glint of metal on the landing craft. The stage was set. Every trench, every bunker, every hidden path would be tested. Every decision Hara had made, every calculation of timing, every rationed bullet would soon confront the overwhelming reality of American firepower. The island, once seemingly tranquil, was now a powder keg. What had begun as preparation and anticipation was about to erupt into a crucible of sound fury and human endurance, a moment that would define the nightmare for Captain Hara and all who fought under him. Captain Hara's nightmare was first and foremost human. His men, a mix of hardened veterans and raw recruits, carried the weight of expectation and fear. Each soldier had trained for months, drilled relentlessly in defensive tactics. Yet the looming American assault was unlike anything many had faced. Hara moved among them, noting taut faces, trembling hands, and eyes that darted between the horizon and the jungle behind them. Courage was abundant, but so was anxiety. The psychological strain was amplified by the knowledge that retreat was impossible, that surrender was considered dishonorable, and that the survival of one's comrades depended on each individual's precision and discipline. In those tense hours, every heartbeat, every whispered order, and every silent prayer was magnified. Hara's men were aware that this was not a battle they could easily win, but the human instinct to fight, endure, and survive remained. From a tactical perspective, Hara faced the brutal calculus of terrain and firepower. The island's cliffs and narrow beaches favored defenders, but the Americans had studied every contour. They planned to neutralize defensive strongpoints through coordinated artillery, naval gunfire, and airstrikes. Hara's layered defenses, trenches, foxholes, machine gun nests were carefully positioned to maximize crossfire and delay the assault. Still, tactical limitations were unavoidable. Sparse artillery, finite ammunition, and restricted mobility meant that a single breach could cascade into disaster. Hara had to calculate each placement, each reserve allocation, with an almost obsessive precision. The American strategy exploited these constraints, emphasizing synchronized attacks that left no time for Japanese forces to recover or reposition. The technology on both sides defined the impending carnage. The U.S. infantry carried M1 Garand rifles, capable of rapid, semi-automatic fire, backed by BARs, Browning automatic rifles, and light machine guns. Artillery support could blanket approaches and shells with deadly accuracy. The Americans had perfected the coordination between air, sea, and land assets, using reconnaissance to pinpoint enemy positions and adjust fire in real time. Hara's forces, by contrast, relied on bolt-action rifles, limited mortar, and a few light machine guns. Their defensive bunkers offered cover but could be neutralized by sustained bombardment. The technological imbalance was stark. The Americans could deliver concentrated fire across multiple vectors simultaneously, while Hara's troops had to stretch limited resources across the entire defensive line. This disparity magnified the stakes of every decision and underscored the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare. Understanding the enemy was central to Hara's strategy. Yet it was also a source of constant anxiety. American forces were methodical, disciplined, and battle-tested. With an unwavering doctrine of coordinated assault, reconnaissance indicated the likely landing points. Yet predicting the exact timing, intensity, and coordination of attacks was impossible. Hara studied the approach, noting the formation of landing craft, the shadow of naval escorts, and the pattern of reconnaissance planes. The Americans were not merely an opponent, they were a force of overwhelming capability, poised to exploit any lapse in Japanese discipline or positioning. For Hara, this understanding was both necessary and terrifying. The more he comprehended their strength, the more acute the pressure on him and his men became. The moral dimension weighed heavily. Japanese doctrine demanded courage, loyalty, and if necessary, self-sacrifice. Retreat or surrender was dishonorable. Hara's men were acutely aware that their actions were not only tactical, but emblematic of personal and national honor. These moral imperatives could inspire extraordinary bravery, but they also intensified fear. Soldiers faced the knowledge that failure would not only cost lives, but tarnish the legacy of those who fell. Hara himself carried the burden of command, the ethical responsibility for his men's lives, and the expectation to uphold military and cultural ideals. This moral calculus intersected tragically with the tactical and technological realities of the battlefield, amplifying the sense of impending doom. By examining the human, tactical, technological, enemy, and moral dimensions, the complexity of the coming battle becomes clear. Each angle reveals a different layer of tension, preparation, and inevitability. The stage was set for an event where strategy, courage, and firepower would collide in a moment of unrelenting intensity. At the heart of the defensive line stood Captain Hara. The fulcrum of command. Leadership in this moment was both an art and a burden. Every order he issued, every repositioning of troops, carried consequences measured in life and death. Hara's challenge was magnified by the fragmented terrain. Thick jungle, jagged cliffs, and narrow beaches made communication difficult, leaving subordinate officers to act on incomplete information. His decisions required a balance of caution and aggression, holding the line without overextending. Limited forces, the weight of responsibility, bore down on him constantly. He walked among the men, assessing morale, reinforcing confidence, and projecting calm. Yet beneath the disciplined exterior, Hara knew the imminent assault could render even the most meticulous planning irrelevant. Leadership meant absorbing fear, uncertainty, and the enormity of the moment, then translating that into actionable strategy that could survive the first violent minutes of battle. The battlefield itself was an unpredictable entity, capable of overriding plans with brutal spontaneity. Even the most disciplined units could falter under sudden artillery barrages or unexpected flanking maneuvers. Hara anticipated this chaos, knowing that defensive positions might be overrun in seconds. Once the Americans began their synchronized assault, the volume and intensity of fire would create confusion. Smoke, explosions, and the cries of wounded men could overwhelm senses, disrupt coordination, and force split-second decisions. Chaos was a force multiplier for the attackers, amplifying the technological and numerical advantage of the Americans. Hara's men would have to respond with instinct, training, and cohesion, or face catastrophic collapse in such moments. The human mind teeters between clarity and panic, and leadership becomes the thread that binds survival to discipline. While Section 1 focused on weaponry, here we explore how technology shaped command and control. The Americans coordinated artillery, naval gunfire and infantry maneuvers through detailed planning. Observation and communication spotters adjusted fire. Forward units relayed enemy movements, and ships beyond the horizon delivered precision bombardments Japanese defenses. In contrast, relied heavily on static positions, limited observation posts, and preset fields of fire, attempted to compensate with careful distribution of reserves and signaling systems. But any disruption in communication could render technological advantages meaningless. The coming battle would illustrate not just the disparity in firepower, but the sophisticated integration of American technology into operational doctrine, a preferen a crenja, force multiplying the lethality of every weapon. Amid all this, the human spirit became a decisive factor. Soldiers confronted not only bullets and shells, but also the weight of anticipation. Fear was omnipresent. Yet discipline and training demanded action. Japanese doctrine instilled a sense of purpose, duty, honor, and the defense of homeland and comrades. This psychological resilience allowed men to operate under extreme stress, maintaining composure in moments where instinct might dictate flight. Hara himself served as a psychological anchor, exemplifying calm determination, yet resilience was fragile. One catastrophic breach, one wave of suppressive fire, could fracture morale instantly. Understanding the fragility and strength of human psychology in combat reveals why individual decisions could ripple into the survival or destruction of entire units. The Americans were not static either. Their tactics reflected learning and adaptation from previous island assaults. Incorporating lessons on timing, coordination, and exploitation of terrain, Hara recognized that his opponents would adjust to resistance. Probing for weaknesses and exploiting any lapse in judgment, the Japanese had prepared for a frontal assault. Yet flexible enemy tactics threatened to undermine fixed positions. Anticipating and countering adaptive strategies required foresight, rapid decision-making, and improvisation, factors that compounded the pressure on leadership and men alike. Every engagement would test both sides' capacity to adapt under fire. Finally, the moral dimension deepened amid chaos and intensity. Japanese soldiers were indoctrinated to resist until the last man. But the relentless onslaught of American firepower created a paradox. Obedience demanded courage, yet survival instincts pulled in the opposite direction. Hara faced the ethical weight of sending men into nearly impossible circumstances. The tension between duty and humanity, between strategy and survival, added a profound dimension to every command. Each life lost was both a tactical consequence and a moral burden, leaving an indelible imprint on the men who survived and on Hara himself. January 17, 1944, at first light, the horizon shimmered with the approach of American forces. The distant thunder of naval guns rolled over the waves, a prelude to the storm that would soon descend. Captain Hara, positioned on the central ridge, scanned the beaches through his binoculars. The landing craft were now clearly visible. Dozens of Higgins boats cutting through the surf, each bristling with men and weapons. The Americans were precise, synchronized, and relentless. At 6:17, the first shells struck the coastal artillery. Manned by Hara's few mortar and limited field guns, answered in bursts. But the response was almost ceremonial against the sheer volume of American firepower. Waves of 5-inch shells and aerial bombs tore through forward trenches, obliterating cover and carving the sand into cratered chaos. Smoke and dust merged with the salt-laden wind, obscuring lines of sight, masking the movement of soldiers, and amplifying the terror of the first minutes. Hara's voice, calm but commanding, cut through the din as he shouted orders to reinforce critical points. Men scrambled, laying down suppressive fire, dragging the wounded into whatever cover remained. By 6:23, the American infantry began landing, the synchronized opening of every rifle, machine gun, and bar created a torrent of lead that swept across the beaches. The sound was deafening, simultaneous bursts ricocheting from sand, coral, and timber for Hara. It was a nightmare realized. The sheer density of fire left little room for maneuver. Foxholes were shredded, sandbags torn apart, and the first waves of Japanese defenders fell before they could even return fire effectively. The Americans advanced with disciplined precision, using pre-planned trajectories and overlapping fire zones to neutralize each defensive strongpoint. Hara attempted counterattacks with small units, sending squads to flank exposed American positions. Each movement was calculated, desperate, and brave, yet the technological superiority of the Americans' rapid-fire rifles, grenades, and flamethrowers transformed even minor maneuvers into deadly gambles. Communication lines were cut almost immediately. Runners fell under machine gun fire, radios failed, and signals became sporadic. Every attempt to coordinate a defense met with instant suppression. Hara realized that the tide of battle was dictated not merely by courage, but by the relentless convergence of firepower, coordination, and timing. By 6:35, the American artillery adjusted to the shifting positions of Japanese defenders. Observers on ships and in aircraft corrected the aim, raining shells precisely where Hara had concentrated reserves. Each detonation reverberated through the cliffs, sending clouds of earth, coral, and splintered timber into the air. Smoke thickened, obscuring friend and foe alike. While the wails of the wounded punctuated the cacophony, Hara moved from position to position, assessing the damage, reinforcing units, and personally dragging soldiers to safety when possible. The rhythm of battle left no time for exhaustion, thought, or hesitation. Survival depended on split-second decisions under an unrelenting storm of fire. At 6:42, the Americans breached the first defensive line. Machine gun nests and trenches were overrun in minutes. Hara ordered a fallback to the secondary positions inland, a jagged network of foxholes and bunkers hidden within the jungle. But the momentum of the attack, compounded by disorientation and casualties, made organized withdrawal almost impossible. Soldiers retreated under covering fire, often moving blind through smoke and chaos, facing both the enemy ahead and the deadly terrain itself. Every step was measured against the potential of instant death. In the center, Hara's own command post came under fire. Splinters of coral and sand tore through the structure, scattering papers and maps. While nearby officers were hit, Hara remained upright, directing reinforcements. Prioritizing sectors that still held, the Americans pressed relentlessly, exploiting gaps, coordinating overlapping fields of fire, and neutralizing strongpoints with terrifying efficiency. It was a display of battlefield orchestration at its peak, a calculated storm designed to annihilate resistance and force submission through both firepower and psychological pressure. By 6:50, the defensive line was effectively shattered. Survivors clung to secondary positions, hurling grenades and firing rifles sporadically. But the cohesion of units had dissolved. Hara, wounded in the shoulder but determined, moved to rally what remained. He understood that the coming minutes would define not just the outcome of this island, but the limits of endurance for his men. Every strategic calculation, every defensive preparation, now collided with the overwhelming reality of the Americans' firepower and coordination. The nightmare had arrived in full force. Every American gun opened at once. Every shell, every burst of machine gun fire, every grenade coalesced into a tidal wave of destruction that surged across the island. Hara's orders became fragments of intention. In a landscape of smoke, fire, and chaos, the battle had entered its crucible phase, a moment in which the skill, courage, and resilience of Japanese forces would be tested beyond their limits. The relentless barrage did not pause by 7 o'clock. The American advance had become a rolling tide across the island, sweeping away what remained of Hara's front lines, the secondary positions. Once thought secure, were under direct assault machine gun fire from elevated positions. Grenades lobbed into foxholes, and the precise coordination of infantry and artillery left defenders scrambling. Hara, though wounded, moved through the chaos, issuing orders, directing retreating units, and attempting to stabilize sectors that were unraveling. Every action was measured against the impossible calculus of survival and duty. Amid the carnage, small pockets of resistance exhibited remarkable courage. A squad entrenched near a coconut grove held their position, using grenades and rifles to delay American advances for precious minutes. Another group, trapped on a cliff edge, improvised makeshift barricades, firing from concealed positions until they were systematically neutralized. These acts of bravery, though heroic, could not alter the inexorable collapse of the defensive line. Each individual struggle was swallowed by the overwhelming firepower converging from sea, land, and air. By 7:15, communications were almost entirely severed, field radios destroyed, runners killed, signals lost, the cohesion of command had fractured. Hara's attempts to coordinate counterattacks were reduced to shouted instructions and hand signals through smoke and debris. Yet even in these fractured conditions, discipline persisted. Soldiers adapted, firing from unconventional positions, using natural cover, and attempting to regroup under the shattered canopy of jungle. Their determination slowed, but could not stop, the relentless American advance. The Americans exploited every breach. Landing craft continued to disgorge troops onto the beaches, while artillery and naval gunfire targeted inland positions. Observers adjusted fire to neutralize resistance systematically, and the precision of this coordination was devastating. Hara's secondary positions were under constant threat, forcing him to make impossible decisions: which units to reinforce, which to abandon, which paths offered a chance of survival. Each choice carried immediate consequences, often measured in lives lost within seconds. At 7:30, a particularly fierce engagement erupted at the Central Ridge, the heart of Hara's command. American troops, advancing under the cover of suppressive fire, reached the base of the ridge. The defenders fired from bunkers and hidden positions, but the weight of coordinated attack proved too great. Explosions tore through positions, smoke obscured visibility, and the roar of rifles created a wall of sound that disoriented both men and officers. Hara moved among his men, personally dragging wounded soldiers to cover, issuing rapid-fire commands, and attempting to rally the surviving units. Yet even his presence could not reverse the momentum of the assault. By 7:45, the ridge itself had fallen. The Americans had systematically neutralized each defensive point, consolidating control and forcing Japanese survivors into the remaining jungle positions. Hara's command had been effectively dismantled, maps destroyed, radios gone, officers killed or wounded. What remained were scattered groups of soldiers, clinging to life, improvising defenses, and attempting to slow the inevitable. Hara, though physically exhausted and bleeding, continued to direct the fragments of his force, refusing to surrender while seeking any opportunity to regroup or counterattack. The human cost became starkly visible. Bodies littered the beaches, trenches, and cliffs. Cries of the wounded echoed through smoke and debris. Hara witnessed the collapse of formations he had meticulously prepared, each loss a painful testament to the ferocity of American firepower and coordination. Yet amidst this destruction, individual acts of heroism shone: soldiers covering retreats, officers sacrificing safety to move wounded men, and small groups holding positions far beyond expectations. These moments, fleeting and fragile, underscored the human dimension of the nightmare unfolding. By 8 o'clock, resistance was fragmented. The Americans, exploiting their overwhelming firepower and coordination, began securing the island systematically. Hara, now isolated with a handful of men, realized that the larger battle was lost. Even as pockets of resistance continued, every strategy, every calculation, Every effort to hold the line had collided with the immutable reality of superior firepower, precise coordination, and relentless pressure. The nightmare that had begun with the opening volley had reached its apex. As the smoke cleared over the shattered beaches and jungle, the scale of devastation became apparent. Hara, surveying the remnants of his command, understood the full measure of the assault. The defensive line was broken, casualties were immense, and the Americans held the momentum. The nightmare was not only the sheer intensity of the attack, but the absolute inevitability with which it had unfolded, a relentless, coordinated force that had tested courage, leadership, and resilience to their limits. In those hours, Captain Hara confronted the culmination of every fear, every calculation, and every moral burden. The island, once a bastion of defensive preparation, had become a crucible of fire, lead, and human endurance. What remained was the aftermath, a landscape defined by loss, courage, and the unyielding logic of modern warfare, setting the stage for the consequences that would reverberate far beyond this single island. By late morning on January 17th, the island had been decisively secured by American forces. The beaches, once lined with trenches and fortified positions, were now littered with shattered bunkers, twisted metal, and the remnants of defensive obstacles torn apart by naval and artillery bombardment. Captain Hara's meticulously prepared defensive line had crumbled within less than 2 hours, a testament to the overwhelming coordination and firepower of the American assault. Survivors clung to the remnants of secondary positions inland, many injured, exhausted, and disoriented, their numbers drastically reduced from the original garrison. Casualty reports later confirmed the scale of devastation. Japanese losses were staggering, with estimates suggesting that over 70% of the garrison had been killed or incapacitated during the initial assault and subsequent collapse of defensive positions. Many bodies lay in the surf, swept by waves, while others remained within trenches and bunkers, marked only by the charred and shattered remains of fortifications. American forces, while advancing with precision, also suffered losses, though comparatively minimal due to sporadic resistance and well-placed sniper fire. The disparity in casualties highlighted the lethal combination of tactical preparation, numerical superiority, and technological advantage wielded by the attackers. Strategically, the fall of the island had immediate consequences for both sides. For the Japanese, the loss severed critical supply lines and further isolated neighboring outposts. Communication networks were disrupted, and the psychological blow to surviving troops was profound. Soldiers who had witnessed the collapse of Hara's command grappled with fear, grief, and a dawning realization of the futility imposed by the overwhelming enemy. Officers struggled to reorganize survivors, establish temporary defensive measures, and maintain discipline under extreme duress. For the Americans, the capture reinforced the effectiveness of their island-hopping campaign. The operation validated the doctrine of synchronized assaults, combining naval bombardment, aerial strikes, and amphibious landings with meticulous reconnaissance. The speed and decisiveness of the victory demonstrated the growing mastery of joint operations in the Pacific Theater. Commanders on the U.S. side noted the minimal losses relative to Japanese casualties as evidence that careful planning, coordination, and firepower integration could decisively shape battlefield outcomes. Reports filed in the days following the assault emphasized the efficiency of the operation while acknowledging the bravery of Japanese defenders, particularly those who delayed advances at critical points, despite insurmountable odds. Beyond immediate tactical outcomes, the battle had a profound psychological impact. Japanese soldiers, witnessing the overwhelming firepower and coordination of American forces, faced a profound erosion of confidence in static defensive strategies. The fall of the island became emblematic of the larger shift in the Pacific War, the transition from early Japanese dominance to a defensive posture. forced onto increasingly isolated and vulnerable positions for surviving troops. The experience reinforced both the necessity of discipline and the peril inherent in underestimating American capability. Captain Hara himself, though surviving the assault, was left to reckon with the destruction of his command. Reports describe him moving through the ruins, attending to the wounded, and documenting positions lost or destroyed. The responsibility for his men weighed heavily. And the human cost of his decisions, the lives lost, the suffering endured, etched a lasting mark on his leadership and psyche. His experience would become a reference point for future Japanese officers facing the relentless progression of the American advance. The aftermath also revealed the limitations of Japanese preparations. Despite detailed defensive measures, layered fortifications, and determined resistance, the island's natural advantages could not withstand the combined assault of modern technology, coordinated fire, and disciplined execution. Every trench, bunker, and obstacle that had been painstakingly prepared was rendered ineffective under the synchronized attack, illustrating the deadly gap between defensive planning and operational reality when facing a superior force. In the smoke and debris of the captured island, a new reality took shape. The battle was over, the defenders decimated, and the Americans firmly in control. Yet the echoes of courage, discipline, and sacrifice endured, marking the island as both a tactical victory and a testament to the human cost of modern warfare. The consequences of this engagement would reverberate across the Pacific Campaign, influencing strategy, morale, and the broader trajectory of the conflict. In the days following the battle, the full impact of the island's capture became evident. American forces consolidated their hold, clearing remaining pockets of resistance and securing key positions. Engineers repaired damaged infrastructure, cleared minefields, and established supply depots to support subsequent operations deeper into Japanese-held territory. The efficiency with which the island was turned from a battlefield into a staging ground highlighted the operational superiority that underpinned the island-hopping strategy for the U.S. military. The victory was not only tactical but symbolic. It demonstrated that carefully coordinated assaults could overcome even the most determined defensive preparations. For the Japanese, the loss triggered a strategic reevaluation. The collapse of Hara's command underscored the dangers of static defense in the face of overwhelming firepower and coordination. Nearby garrisons, now aware of the Americans' operational precision, faced heightened anxiety and uncertainty. Supply lines were increasingly threatened by naval interdiction. While reinforcements were often delayed or entirely blocked, High Command issued directives emphasizing mobility, counterattacks, and flexible defense. Yet the reality on the ground made such measures difficult to implement. The psychological impact of the defeat permeated the ranks, weakening confidence in traditional doctrines and heightening the sense of vulnerability. Historical reports provide stark documentation of the battle's toll. U.S. after-action summaries describe the engagement as a textbook demonstration of combined arms warfare. Naval artillery, airstrikes, and infantry movements synchronized to maximize effectiveness while minimizing casualties. Japanese resistance, though courageous and organized in isolated pockets, was deemed ineffective against coordinated, overwhelming force. Survivor accounts from Hara's men corroborate this, detailing the intensity of the bombardment, the chaos of the American assault, and the collapse of defensive positions in minutes. These first-hand narratives, preserved in war diaries and military archives, offer insight into the human dimension of the battle: fear, determination, and the instinctive drive to survive under near-impossible conditions. The aftermath also reshaped the tactical environment in the Pacific. American planners, emboldened by the operation's success, applied lessons learned to subsequent island assaults, refining artillery calibration, landing craft deployment, and coordination between ground and naval forces. Japanese commanders, conversely, faced mounting pressure to adapt. Though logistical constraints and the cumulative effect of previous defeats limited their capacity for effective response, the capture of the island accelerated the erosion of Japanese defensive depth, foreshadowing the increasing difficulty of sustaining isolated outposts as the U's advanced toward Japan's inner perimeter. Psychologically, the battle left enduring scars for American soldiers. The intensity of resistance, even in the face of overwhelming odds, reinforced respect for the enemy and the harsh realities of combat for Japanese survivors. The experience crystallized the futility imposed by superior firepower and coordination, challenging morale and faith in traditional military doctrines. Hara himself would carry the weight of command decisions and their consequences, a personal reminder of the human cost of both strategy and circumstance. In broader terms, the island's capture exemplified the transformation of warfare in the Pacific theater. No longer could static defenses, however well prepared, withstand the combined might of integrated naval, air, and land operations. The battle revealed the decisive role of technology, coordination, and disciplined execution, underscoring the shift from attritional engagements to precise, overwhelming assaults designed to neutralize enemy positions rapidly. It also illuminated the interplay between human courage and operational reality. Individual valor could delay, but not ultimately reverse, the momentum of a superior force. By the end of January, the island was firmly in American hands. The remnants of Japanese resistance confined to scattered, isolated positions. Strategically, it became a launch point for further operations, while psychologically it served as a stark warning to other Japanese garrisons. The battlefield was silent now. Yet the echoes of Hara's nightmare lingered, testimony to the intensity of modern warfare, the interplay of human courage and technological might, and the high cost of confrontation in a rapidly evolving theater of conflict. Captain Hara's nightmare was more than a single battle. It was a crucible of human courage, leadership, and endurance under the most relentless conditions of modern warfare. The island, once a stronghold of calculated defenses and disciplined troops, became a stage for the overwhelming force of synchronized firepower, technology, and strategy in the span of hours. Meticulous plans met an unstoppable reality, and the human dimension of combat fear, determination, and moral responsibility was brought into stark relief. The clash highlighted the profound shift in warfare during the Pacific Campaign's static fortifications and valor, while historically significant, could no longer withstand the integrated might of combined arms operations. The Americans demonstrated the power of coordination, precision, and relentless execution, while the Japanese defenders revealed both the bravery and the limitations imposed by circumstance. Every bullet fired, every decision made, every act of courage or desperation was a testament to the human cost behind strategic calculations. Yet amidst devastation, there's clarity. The battle underscores the interplay between technology and humanity, between doctrine and improvisation, between command and instinct. Captain Hara's leadership, though ultimately overwhelmed, exemplified the weight of responsibility in moments where survival and duty collide. His men's resilience, even in the face of near-certain defeat, serves as a reminder that valor is not measured solely by success, but by the steadfastness of action in impossible conditions. In historical perspective, the island's fall marked both a tactical and psychological turning point in the Pacific War. It illuminated the evolving nature of combat, the consequences of technological disparity, and the stark realities confronting those on the front lines. Yet, beyond strategy and statistics, it is a story of human experience, the tension between courage and fear, the weight of command and the endurance of soldiers confronting the unimaginable. Hara's nightmare, frozen in the fog of war, remains a lens through which we understand the brutal calculus of modern battle and the profound humanity that persists even under the most devastating circumstances in the smoke. Sand and shattered bunkers, the echoes of bravery, tragedy, and resilience endure, a somber reflection on the cost of conflict and the indelible imprint of war on those who endure it.